Welcome to the show. You're listening to Green Hell, a Vietnam War podcast. Join me as I explore the history of the Vietnam War, remember the sacrifices and experiences of those who were there, and preserve those lessons learned and paid for through blood and unimaginable human suffering. Hey everybody, welcome to the show. I'm your host, Stephen Comstock. As of this recording is August 20th, 2025. It's been a little while since the last episode, which was the American Revolution special that I dropped on 4th of July. I've been a little busy, getting married pretty soon, so while my fiance has done the legwork of planning, the vast legwork of planning, I had a little bit to say about that, which took up some of my time, but regrettably, a good amount of my time was unfortunately invested in finally beating Resident Evil 4 and, not regrettably, burning through some of the Vietnam reading backlog that I have. But alas, we're back at it today, and I'm so happy that you guys are joining me because today we're going to talk about General Giap's third attempt to go toe-to-toe with the French, which is part of the transition to the general counteroffensive as prescribed by Mao Zedong's three-stage theory that you start with guerrilla troops, evolve to semi-regular hybrid warfare, and then fully transition into toe-to-toe conventional warfare to defeat an enemy who is imperialist in nature and equipped with greater training and weaponry. After that, we're going to talk about the so-called meat grinder battle of Hoa Binh. So I'm excited for this episode. It's going to be a little longer than usual, but we're going to cover a lot of stuff, and it's going to put us through 1952 so that when we get back at it in the next episode, we'll be in 1953, one step closer to the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which I don't know that I've mentioned at all, maybe once or twice, but spoiler alert, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu goes down in the history books as the battle of battles for the French fight in Indochina. Now, just a quick recap. So in the fall of 1950, General Giap's forces engaged in what became known as the Border Offensive of 1950, in which the Viet Minh successfully displaced the French troops that were garrisoned in a string of border forts all along the China-Vietnam border. This served as a major morale boost, and it made General Giap and the other communist leaders consider whether or not they were really ready to go toe-to-toe with the French in open conventional warfare. They thought that they were, so the following months, in January 1951, General Giap initiates his first attempt to break through the French lines and defeat them in a classic conventional battle. And this took place at Vinh Yên, which was a town along the road to Hanoi, if you will. Idea was the Viet Minh were going to come down out of the hills to the west of Hanoi, and they were going to come down moving from northwest to southeast out of the hills into the plains and head straight in for Hanoi. The French caught wind of this, and they placed a bunch of troops in the hills around this town known as Vinh Yên, and when the Viet Minh started coming down out of the hills, they basically held them off. Though it was a very hairy battle and a lot of French died, but a lot more Viet Minh died because the French had the major advantage of artillery, but also napalm. The largest air bombardment of the entire French Indochina War was conducted to keep the Viet Minh horde from progressing onto Hanoi. Every plane in the country that was capable of dropping bombs was summoned, and that includes non-bomber aircraft, non-fighter jets. Basically, if a cargo plane had a door that could open and a canister of napalm could be pushed out the back, it was being called in. And so thousands of Vietnamese Viet Minh fighters were killed by artillery, machine guns, and napalm, and this halted their first attempt at defeating the French in a classic battle. Now, General Giap, he wasn't ready to call it quits, and so General Giap decided a new tactic. He left a sizable amount of his force well west of where the French main area of control was. And this was a diversion tactic meant to split some of the French forces towards that group. And as a result of that distraction, he moved 2/3 of his main force into the hills directly north of Haiphong, which, as you'll recall, is pretty near Hanoi, but it's right there on the coast, a little bit east of Hanoi, and there's a string of mountains that are just north of the port city of Haiphong. So that's where his troops went into, and this is a classic tactic for the Viet Minh because they had full control and were very comfortable navigating the hills around these populated areas in the Red River Delta. Now, just a reminder, the Red River Delta is a flatter area where a lot of rice production and other crops are grown. There's also a lot of port cities, and Hanoi and Haiphong, the jewels of French colonial Vietnam, are located in this area, and it serves a major source of profit motivation for the French colonial capitalist system. Long story short, the Viet Minh come down out of the hills again. They overrun some outposts, but when they get to the town of Mau Khe, the French there bravely fight. And by French, we mean several different groups of French adjacent peoples fighting together, okay? So you had the Vietnamese that were pro-France, okay? You had the colonial troops that Mother France had summoned to fight on behalf of French interests in Vietnam, in this case, the Moroccans and the Senegalese, among others. And you had French-born officers controlling these groups and some French NCOs. So by and large, the actual citizens of France, from France proper, I mean Europe, France, there weren't a whole lot of them. They were there, and they were in leadership roles, but the vast majority of grunts, if you will, were either Vietnamese or colonial troops from some other part of the world that France had dominion over. In any event, these French soldiers hold the line and yet again defeat the Viet Minh coming down out of the hills. It ends up being a crazy battle in the village of Mau Khe. Essentially, French artillery and the fact that the entire village starts burning down created like kind of a natural fire barrier. And I think that is a large reason why the Viet Minh were not able to completely decimate the French and then take control of the city. When something is burning, whether you want it to or not, you're not going to be able to do much about it until it stops burning. And once the daylight returned, the French were able to call in their bombers, and they already had artillery dialed in on key avenues of approach. So the Viet Minh really didn't have much option but to fall back and retreat. But in addition to the air support and artillery that the French had on hand, they also sailed several destroyers up the Red River from the coast, and these naval assets just bombarded the crap out of these Viet Minh soldiers that were swarming the hills leading up to Mau Khe. So taken together, this degraded their forces enough to where they fell back and retreated. So the second attempt by General Giap failed, just like the first. Now, this brings us to General Giap's third attempt to smash through the French and gain a big piece, if not complete control, of the Red River Delta. This time, he decided that he was going to do something new, and he was going to come in from the south. And I'm quoting here from Bernard B. Fall, Street Without Joy, quote, "A classical maneuver which combined the frontal attack by his regular divisions with an attack from inside the delta directed against the front by two regular Viet Minh infantry regiments which had been previously infiltrated into the delta," end quote. All right, so what does that mean? It's not a super complicated concept. It can get wordy when you try to describe it, but I'm gonna make it as simple as I know how. Okay, you have a main force attacking straight forward into an enemy line. Okay, imagine that it's a trench. In this case, it wasn't trenches. It was like a string of outposts that were connected by one road, okay, or a river, right? But you've got a main force, and they're just tacking head on, trying to overrun these outposts, which is the modus operandi for the Viet Minh in general. Then, at the same time, you already have a group of soldiers that have been infiltrating behind enemy lines well ahead of this advance, so that by the time the main force starts attacking the front line, this group that has already infiltrated behind enemy lines is ready to activate and conduct harassing operations. Harassing operations means they're either going to raid enemy supply depots or enemy outposts that are going to be dispatched to reinforce the front line, or they're going to do anything in their power to destroy or otherwise slow supply lines that are feeding the troops at the front with beans, bullets, and medicine, and people, of course. Okay, so that's the general concept, but now I want to try my best to illustrate in your mind's eye the geography of this area of operation. All right, so remember, you have Haiphong directly on the coast, okay? Now, connecting Haiphong to Hanoi, almost due west. It's like slightly northwest Hanoi is of Haiphong, but for all intents and purposes, let's just say that it's mostly due west, okay? It's Hanoi. And they're connected by road number 5. Then, more or less due south from Hanoi is a town known as Ninh Binh, which is not that far from the coast, maybe about 25 kilometers or so from the coast, okay? And that's road number 1. So you got 2 legs of the triangle, road number 5 connecting Haiphong and Hanoi, and road number 1 connecting Hanoi in the town known as Ninh Binh. Then the final leg of the triangle is the general coastline of Vietnam and the ocean. Okay, now to add some detail onto this. Basically, everything north of Haiphong and Hanoi are treacherous mountains where the Viet Minh are able to live because of the thick jungle canopy and the treacherous terrain, which makes it easier for them to escape and evade and hide from mobile groups dispatched by the French to destroy them. And everything north of that area up to China and into China is friendly territory to the Viet Minh. Okay. Then just west of Hanoi is what's called the Day River. And the Day River runs, I don't really know which direction the water flows. I assume it goes from north to south into the ocean. Yeah, it's definitely north to south because the mountains are to the north. So the water flows north to south and it flows down into the ocean. And this Day River parallels road number 1, which connects Hanoi to Ninh Binh. And everything west of the Day River is in the hands of the Viet Minh. And so what you got here is a triangle of French control with the major population center of Hanoi and Haiphong surrounded by hilly areas that are controlled by the Viet Minh. Now, Inside this triangle of French control, there are pockets of Viet Minh control. And the pockets of Viet Minh control are those areas that are pretty isolated from the main urban population centers and not really connected to the main roads. And therefore, they're easier for the Viet Minh to maintain control of because it's harder for the French to get in there and access them and control the villages that comprise these pockets of control. And as it's been said by Christopher Goscha, these pockets of control shrink and expand as the villages on the outskirts of these pockets come under the influence of either French or Viet Minh soldiers. All right, so for those of you who are military minded and understand the lingo, I want you to think of road number 1 as a phase line for the Viet Minh assault against the French in this area, okay? Now, road number 1 is critical because, like I said, it connects Hanoi to Ninh Binh, but it also is like the only corridor by which French reinforcements and supplies are going to be able to travel south and reinforce the troops at Ninh Binh. Now, General Giap, being the military-minded thinker and strategist that he was, recognizes that if he can blast the French troops that are stationed along this road number 1, especially those outposts between the lower third of the road and the coast, he can cause a situation where the French will be forced to send reinforcements and supplies down road number 1. But as we know, with the Viet Minh, they're very, very good at harassing the French who come down these roads because these roads are often winding through steep cliffs and treacherous terrain, which provide perfect canalizing effects for an ambush. So anyway, at the south of road number 1 is Ninh Binh, as I said, and General Giap is going to have his 308th Division power across the Day River and assault Ninh Binh, which he considers to be the anchor of the French position in the area. Also, a little bit north along road number 1 is a town known as Phu Lai, and General Giap is going to have his 304th Division power due east across the Day River and attack this village. Idea being, if they can bog down the French at this area and intercept French reinforcements coming south from Hanoi down road number 1, they will be able to draw them in while the troops that have infiltrated behind enemy lines isolate the rest of French reinforcements that might be coming from other parts of the Red River Delta, so that all these garrisons along road number 1 and along the Day River are isolated, cut off, and able to be completely annihilated. So a quick word about the troops that were infiltrating behind enemy lines, the Viet Minh troops. There was the 64th Infantry Regiment, which was a part of the 320th Division, and it infiltrated 30 kilometers, which, according to my basic math, is about 18 miles or so, behind French lines to a place called Tay Binh, where it joined forces with, quote, the Independent Infantry Regiment number 42, a crack Viet Minh outfit which was permanently stationed behind French lines and which survived all French efforts at annihilating it until the end of the war, end quote. Now, I'm going to read a passage here from Bernard B. Fall because I think he does a pretty good job of articulating that which I struggle with. So here goes. Quote, the terrain lent itself ideally to a surprise attack. The western bank of the Day River rose steeply over the French-held eastern bank, and the alluvial dishpan flat plain of the Red River Delta was studded in this area by steep limestone cliffs covered with dense vegetation and pierced by innumerable caves and holes which offered perfect bomb-proof concealment to enemy forces. The only advantage which played in favor of the French was that the river itself was navigable enough to permit the support of the French garrisons by one of the famous rivercraft units constituted by the French Navy for the specific purpose of supporting landborne units along the many Indo-Chinese rivers. This concentration of mobile riverborne firepower permitted fairly effective attacks on the enemy's supply lines, which, of necessity, had to cross the Day River. So, anyway, I hope that paints a decent enough picture of the terrain and the geography and the area of operations. It's way easier if you look at a map, but alas, this is a podcast. So, anyway, the initial Viet Minh attack began on May 29th and was benefited by the total surprise the Viet Minh unleashed on the French. At dawn, the bulk of the 308th Infantry Division overran the French positions around Ninh Binh. The Viet Minh were very successful in this initial onslaught. There was chaos. Nobody knew what was going on. The Viet Minh forces powered through. The French who were there basically got overrun immediately, and those who weren't killed were either pinned down or they fell back and retreated into a church at the town of Ninh Binh. Now, this is where it gets pretty interesting. Quoting here from Bernard Bifal. Quote, during that chaotic first night of the battle, a battalion of hastily gathered Vietnamese reinforcements from nearby Nam Dinh was thrown into the battle. One of its companies, headed by the French commander-in-chief's only child, Lieutenant Bernard de Lattre, was ordered to hold at all costs a French fort situated on a crag overlooking Ninh Binh. In spite of intense mortar shelling, de Lattre's company held on, but when dawn came, young de Lattre and two of his senior NCOs lay dead on the crag. Before the Indochina War was over, 20 more sons of French marshals and generals were to die in it as officers. Another 22 died in Algeria later. End quote. All right, so I just want to put in my 2 cents here. Basically, it's this. You don't have to agree with French policy in Vietnam. Just the same way you don't have to agree with Viet Minh policy in Vietnam. To say that both sides displayed honor, and I find the fact that commander-in-chief of the entire French operation in Vietnam at this time, Marshal de Lattre de Tassigny, his son was also there in the battle, in the war, and lost his life. And that just goes to show you that, whether or not you agree with the French policy or the French politics, the fact of the matter was that these generals, some of them at least, especially Marshal de Lattre de Tassigny and his son, were committed to fighting for Mother France, presumably because they believed that Mother France was a force for good in the world that was doing more good for the people for the people of Earth, for the people of Vietnam, than it was doing bad. I mean, I assume that most people believe themselves to be the good guys in historical context. But regardless, Marshal de Lattre de Tassigny lost his son in battle, so you can't say he didn't sacrifice his son, whereas we see in the American war in Vietnam, a lot of generals, high-ranking generals, did not sacrifice their sons. Politicians in America were not sacrificing their sons or even giving their sons up for the draft. Anyway, getting back on the topic. At the same time, or at least around the same time, as these French forces were being overrun by the Viet Minh, a dispatched French riverborne unit was sent up the river to come to the aid of those at Ninh Binh. As they were coming up, the Viet Minh unleashed a ambushed with mounted bazookas and recoilless rockets on both sides of the river, just streaming across, blowing up everything and destroying the French reinforcements to the extent that the French reinforcements were unable to deploy their group and help the Ninh Binh. French high command caught word of this and quickly reacted, and within 48 hours, 3 mobile groups, 4 artillery groups, 1 armored group, and the 7th Colonial Paratroop Battalion were thrown into the fray. This major influx of French troops into the area was enough to break the Viet Minh attempt at pushing through the lines and causing widespread destruction of the French forces in the Red River Delta. The climax of the battle is reported by Bernard B. Fall as June 4th through 5th, with the key post of Yen Khu Ha changing hands several times. Despite the bulk of enemy troops coming across the Day River at Ninh Binh, the French rivercraft and aircraft destroyed the hundreds of small little boats that the Viet Minh were using to haul supplies across the Day River to reinforce their assault into the Red River Delta. As a result, the Viet Minh fell back across the Day River and retreated back into the hills. By June 18th, 1951, the third battle for the Delta had ended. A decisive defeat for the Viet Minh. In fact, it may seem like their third decisive defeat, but as Bernard B. Fall puts it, quote, all the battles had been less than conclusive victories for the French, but had given the Viet Minh an ample opportunity to measure their own limitations and to find out the major weaknesses of the French. Val Nguyen Giap was never again to forget the lessons for which his troops had paid so dearly. End quote. Okay, so from the summer of 1951 through November 1951, the efforts by the Viet Minh shift to a mountainous region where a tribe of indigenous people called the Thai mountain tribes live. And these people really were resistant to Viet Minh control. They had historically always been autonomous, even with the French. And in fact, they were allied with the French, who they considered to be the better option compared with the Viet Minh. So between April 1951 and September 1951, the Viet Minh are trying to assert control of this area. The French end up, with the help of the Thai, pushing them out. And for a brief period, the Viet Minh push north into China and escape. This does provide the French a moment to, instead of going on the reactionary course of action, they can now be proactive. So Marshal Jean de Lattre de Tassany devises a plan that's going to take the fight to the Viet Minh, and for once the French will be going on the offensive. This supposedly proactive military plan that Marshal de Lattre de Tassany developed was known and would become known as the Meat Grinder Battle of Hoa Binh. It lasted from November 14th, 1951, all the way through February 24th, 1952. So Hoa Binh is about 47 miles west of Hanoi, connected at the time by road number 6. It's important strategically and politically for the French during this period of time. So let me dive into those considerations real quick. From a practical standpoint, Hoa Binh was a major link between the northeastern communist strongholds, which were receiving Chinese military blockade and equipment, and the central Vietnamese stronghold around Thanh Hoa, where the 320th Communist Division was operating almost completely isolated from the rest of the Viet Minh forces. For the French, gaining control of Hoa Binh and the area around it wouldn't completely cut off the central and southern areas where the Viet Minh were operating, but it would slow the influx of supplies and equipment and reduce their ability to develop production of ammunition and also like infrastructure maintenance for their broader supply route. And if you think about it, that's like one of the most important things in military doctrine, right? If you can cut off the supply route, especially in this case where the Chinese were pumping in major supplies, and that was trickling from the north down into central and even further down into southern Vietnam. It's a very strategic endeavor to try to choke that off as best as possible. The French didn't really believe that they could completely sever that supply link because, as we've learned, the Viet Minh are extremely good about getting people and supplies in and around the mountains, but they knew that it would at least slow down and reduce the supply that could get to the central and southern parts. Additionally, this area was home to 2 battalions of Muong tribesmen, and these people were very loyal to the French, and the French considered it paramount to keep them on their side and to do whatever they could to gain and maintain the Muong tribesmen's loyalty. And therefore, that meant keeping and maintaining Hoa Binh under French control because Hoa Binh was the capital of the Muong tribe and therefore served as a kind of psychological point of consideration for the French and for the Muong alike. The French also had another political consideration back home in France, and that was that the French National Assembly was getting ready to debate the budget for Indochina in fiscal year 1952 through 1953, and the French government was really in need of a major victory in order to secure good funding voted for by the French government. But in addition to that, the French were really hoping to impress the Americans and show that, hey, we are capable of delivering a severe and decisive blow to these pathetic Viet Minh peasants who don't even constitute a real military. And by drawing them into this area, Hoa Binh, and trapping them in the meat grinder, as they considered it, we can get American involvement and get them to supply more weapons and pump more funding into our war effort. It's the same now as it was back then. All these countries across the world, whenever they find themselves in a difficult military situation that they can't afford, they come knocking to Uncle Sam, asking with their hands out for Americans' hard-earned taxpayer dollars. So, in short, French big brain military tacticians thought, hey, we're going to get control of Hoa Binh. It's going to sever the link between communist supply flowing in from China and moving south to the central and southern parts of the country. And also, it's going to win us more favor with the Muong tribespeople who consider Hoa Binh as their capital. And furthermore, we're going to draw the Viet Minh into this area and we're just going to grind them up in the meat grinder. They're going to come in because we're all here and we're going to be ready and we're just going to decimate them. And it's going to deliver a huge blow, which is going to win over the favor of the Americans, who are going to be much more willing to support our war effort and pump in equipment and dollars. And so at dawn on November 14th, 1951, 3 paratroop battalions executed an airborne operation and jumped into Hoa Binh, occupying the city with almost no resistance. Simultaneously, 15 infantry battalions, 7 artillery battalions, 2 armored groups, and two riverine groups began pushing their way into the Black River Valley. Okay, so now the Black River is one of two supply links that the French had access to pump men and material into the Hoa Binh area. The other supply route was a road called Road Number 6. Now, Road Number 6 was pretty much decimated by the Viet Minh in the 1940s, and then further bombarded by the French, and had never really been repaired. So at best, it was an unimproved road, certainly not capable of large military transport vehicles and big convoys coming through with ease. So the French really only had one real good option to bring in troops and supplies, and that was the Black River. French engineers would do their best to kind of bring this road up to speed with their bulldozers and heavy equipment, but as you would imagine, right, like this is prime ambush territory. As we've seen throughout the war thus far, the Viet Minh are real good at it. So they would just constantly harass these engineers with bazooka, rocket, small arms fire, and at the very least, the French have to stop what they're doing and fight off these Viet Minh, or at least wait until the infantry can secure the left and right flank of the road so that they can continue to do what they need to do to fix the road and get it ready for major resupply. And due to the difficulties of utilizing Road Number 6, the Black River ends up being the more advantageous supply route for the French because it allowed for the transport of heavy bulk landing craft, and most places on the river provided a wider field of fire than that of the narrow road. Even so, you have to imagine that these lumbering landing craft cruising up this river provided kind of flat broadside targets for Viet Minh sitting off the bank of the river with bazookas and recoilless rifles in hand, ready to sink these craft. And as it turns out, the challenges of securing both Road Number 6 and the Black River would prove to be the name of the game for this entire operation. Not that long after this operation begins, and due to the fact that the French pushed into the Hoa Binh area, found little resistance, and began to pump people into this area, they discovered that it takes a lot of effort to secure these supply lines because, as has always been the problem, the Viet Minh are perfectly able and willing to conduct ambushes along these routes, which are going to at the very least slow down and at the very worst kill and destroy precious French supplies and troops. Furthermore, General Giap had already infiltrated elements of the 316th and 320th Infantry Divisions into the northern flank of the Delta so that they could penetrate deeply into the French lowland positions and disorganize French supply lines feeding the Hoa Binh pocket. The French, desperately seeking to maintain and gain more and more control of the Road Number 6 and Black River, decided that the only thing they could do was basically just construct a system of forts and strong points on either side of the main communication arteries. As the French effort to maintain and gain more and more control around Hoa Binh commences, it ends up proving more and more difficult to resupply the string of outposts covering the approaches, which in many ways was as difficult, if not more so, than supplying Hoa Binh itself. Because you got to think, all those outposts require supplies too. So it just kind of becomes just a logistical nightmare to get supplies up Road Number 6 and up the Black River, not only to Hoa Binh, but also to every one of these outposts, especially when the Viet Minh are constantly harassing these operations and they've infiltrated elements to further disrupt your supply and logistical capabilities. the Viet Minh would isolate some of these strong points and outposts, cut them off, and the French, wanting to reopen supply and keep their people from being completely overrun, would desperately attempt to reopen contact with these overrun outposts. And in so doing, the battles just to keep these outposts from being overrun and to maintain supply lines to them proved to be just chaos and bloody. And by the time the French government realized that it was more effort than it was worth, the French high command found themselves in a conundrum as to how to extricate their forces from this area without causing huge losses on the exfil and without losing face in front of the whole world, who had already begun hyping this operation in Western media as, quote, a pistol pointed at the heart of the enemy. Bernard B. Fall writes about this particular incident, I think, because it becomes indicative of the French problem in Indochina in general. Like, no matter what they do, right, despite their numerical superiority, in a lot of cases, and despite their better training and better tactics, it ends up just becoming a quagmire. They just get bogged down. The terrain is difficult. The enemy's elusive. And it ends up being so costly just to supply these outposts that aren't even effective at controlling the area because the Viet Minh, like they have always done, fade into the hills and push into China where they can refit, reorganize, reconsolidate, and prepare for follow-on actions. By December 9th, 1951, 2 regiments of the Viet Minh 312th Division and 1 regiment of the 308th had positioned themselves and were poised to go on the offensive against the French at an outpost known as Tu Vu. As fate would have it, on the 10th in the morning, 3 French infantry battalions with an artillery battalion and a contingent of French Air Force giving them air support, plus tanks, managed to make chance contact with about 5 enemy Viet Minh battalions actively moving to attack Tu Vu. But despite their best efforts, the Viet Minh were able to break through or otherwise evade these French forces, and they conducted their assault against Tu Vu that night of the 10th at 2100 hours. Now, this is another one of these crazy outpost battles that become kind of a staple of French Indochina war stories, right? At Tu Vu, it was defended by 2 Moroccan rifle companies and 1 tank platoon. And this strong point was divided into 2 separate strong points connected by a footbridge because these strong points were butted up against the Black River. So the Black River to the rear, and then in between them was a little tributary from the Black River. And the only thing connecting these 2 strong points was 1 meager little footbridge. Now, on the outskirts of these strong points was barbed wire or razor wire, concertina wire, sandbag embankments, and minefields. As we know with the Viet Minh, minefields and, physical barriers don't matter that much when you have hordes and hordes and hordes of Viet Minh perfectly willing to charge forward into their death. That night, around 2100, thousands of Viet Minh had converged to assault Tu Vu. They began with a 40-minute bombardment, which just dropped on the French position. And, if it didn't blow up the concertina wire or detonate some of the mines, at the very least is keeping the French, hunkered down, not looking super well, and not gaining sight pictures on the enemy that's creeping ever closer. At 22:10, shrill screams of Tien Len were heard as enemy infantry crossed the barbed wire and minefields without regard for personal safety and charged the French position. So just imagine it, right? Just all of a sudden, like the mortar fire lifts You look up, there's smoke and haze, it's kind of clearing, and you just see these black, shadowy, skinny Viet Minh figures emerging and sprinting towards your position en masse into the minefields. People just blowing up, body parts flying around, legs and arms and heads and torsos and guts everywhere. And the ones who make it past the minefields are jumping onto the concertina wire, getting mowed down by the machine guns. They're just cranking out, going full cyclic, cutting down these human waves. And as it turns out, enough people die on the barbed wire, you don't really have that much barbed wire anymore. You just got corpses, which the follow-on enemy is going to be able to charge over. And you got enough of them coming at you, as some of them are going to get through eventually. French machine guns, small arms, and artillery just completely mowed down these human waves, which came after one after another. Regardless, by 2340, it became clear that the southern strongpoint was being overrun. The surviving troops at this strongpoint had no choice but to rapidly retreat across the little footbridge to the northern strongpoint, where they could reconsolidate, refit, reorganize, and prepare for a counterattack against the onslaught that kept on coming. At 3 a.m. that night, 5 Viet Minh battalions threw themselves against the 200-plus men stationed to defend Tu Vu. The tanks of the armored platoon had their guns lowered down as low as they could possibly go, shooting shells into hordes of charging Viet Minh. It was absolutely horrifying slaughter for everybody involved. Despite the firepower just absolutely annihilating these waves upon waves of Viet Minh, eventually enough of them swarmed around the tanks and basically occupied every square foot of free space that was available. The tanks did what they could to drive and maneuver, and they crushed many Viet Minh who were unlucky enough to get in their ways. But despite that, like ants, the Viet Minh crawled all over the tanks and stuffed incendiary hand grenades into the tank cannons, fired their Tommy guns into the driving slits, and eventually destroyed the tanks with point-blank bazooka blasts, which blew up their hulls and killed all tank crews to the last man. 5 tank crews in total died being roasted alive in their tanks. By this point, the garrison of Tu Vu had completely fallen under the swarm of Viet Minh soldiers. Those who were remaining threw themselves down the steep embankment into the Black River and then waded to a small little island that was just off the bank of the river, where they prepared to make a final stand. As it turns out, though, the Viet Minh either didn't care or didn't realize that any survivors had escaped to this little island in the middle of the river, and they were content with their victory, having overrun and killed all the French that they could find, at least, in the outpost. And so by dawn, they packed up, the Viet Minh that is, and slipped back into the jungle, leaving behind the decimated wreckage of Tu Vu. The surviving Moroccan colonial troops who holed up on this little island in the river decided to, go check out what was going on since they stopped hearing anything at Tu Vu. They crawled back in and found that the Viet Minh had left and had stripped the outpost completely of all weapons and anything that could be useful to them in their war effort. But the Viet Minh also left behind more than 400 of their comrades who had been killed in action during the assault. 400. That's a lot of people to be lying around all over the place in varying states of complete and utter mutilation. Many similar battles like this raged all through December and into January, as the Viet Minh overran outposts. The French would be displaced, and then they would fight to take it back. It was a back and forth for control of these areas all along Road Number 6 and the Black River. And at a certain point, the French decided that they were going to reinforce this area with mobile groups number 1, 4, 7, plus the 1st Airborne Group. But that didn't matter because the Viet Minh, being wise enough to know when they couldn't win, would never fight on the French terms. And whenever they knew that they didn't have the numerical superiority, they would just fall back and hide in the many limestone caves that surrounded the Black River and Road Number 6, where they would hide out and wait to pop out and fight when the time was right. The Viet Minh during this time relied on the tried and true tactic of simply grinding down French forces a little bit at a time. They know that at a certain point, the French are going to realize that this is too costly and it's not worth the effort anymore. And all they got to do is just keep it up a little bit at a time until the French decide to give up. And that's exactly what happens. And so the meat grinder battle of Hoa Binh, which was originally designed by the French to be a meat grinder for the Viet Minh, ends up being a meat grinder for the French. Also during this battle were intense firefights on the river, where these riverine forces would get into just massive firefights with the Viet Minh who were on the riverbank, and these flotillas of French armored vehicles and riverine craft would just mortar and machine gun and shoot anything and everything along the coastlines in their best efforts to continue resupplying these outposts and Hoa Binh itself. Bernard B. Fall speculates, quote, "Probably the bloodiest river battles since the American Civil War were fought out between the French and Viet Minh in the restricted confines of the Black River, and later on the various tributaries of the Red River in the Delta area, with ships being attacked and sunk by gunfire, mines, and even frogmen," end quote. The Viet Minh end up being so effective at attacking and preventing freedom of movement by the French on the Black River that the French abandon the river completely and begin now a major effort along Road Number 6. The Viet Minh at this point had gained the high ground surrounding Hoa Binh. Armed with communist weaponry, this allowed them to pound the Hoa Binh airfield with artillery and use anti-aircraft weapons to keep the French Air Force from effectively napalming the crap out of them. Due to this, the French lost 6 aircraft. The French had decided to defend Hoa Binh with 5 infantry battalions and 1 artillery battalion. However, Road Number 6 itself was only defended by 10 strongpoints that comprised a total of 1 infantry battalion and 1 artillery battalion, plus 2 armored battalions. The Viet Minh, having the numerical superiority against the troops guarding Road Number 6, deployed the entire 304th Division and their Regiment 88 of the 308th Division, who were all fully equipped with Chinese equipment and American equipment that the Chinese had picked up off the battlefield in Korea and shipped over to the Viet Minh. Needless to say, but if you're a French soldier and you're stationed at an outpost along the Black River, in Hoa Binh proper, or along Route Number 6, there's a good chance that things are going to get pretty hairy for you at some point. One of those cases is the French Foreign Legion stationed at a place called Giap. I really don't know if I said that right. It's a very weirdly spelled word. But without reiterating the name, which I can't really pronounce that well, I'll just tell you that it's a hill that was right up against Route Number 6, and it was occupied by the 2nd Battalion of the French Foreign Legion's 13th Half Brigade. Now, this unit was considered to be pretty elite, probably akin to the 75th Ranger Regiment in today's parlance. They were not your poorly trained or weak-minded colonial troops, right? The French Foreign Legion is world-renowned to this day for being some of the best fighters in the world. Anyway, this element was comprised of 4 companies: 5th Company, 6th Company, 7th Company, and 8th Company. This hill that they occupied was kind of a long, skinny, oval-shaped hill with 2 strong points. One strong point to the west and one strong point to the east. The eastern strong point was maintained by the 7th Company, and the western one was maintained by the 5th. In between these 2 strong points was a communication trench. Surrounding the northern perimeter of this hill and this outpost was a minefield and barbed wire, etc., the standard outpost stuff. They really liked minefields, by the way, back then, turns out, which you can't say I blame them, especially when you're dealing with hordes of charging Viet Minh. But anyway, just to the south of this hill was Route number 6, and in between the strong points occupied by the 5th and the 7th, the 6th Company was kind of in between Route number 6 and the top of the hill. And then just on the backside of Route number 6 to the south was 8th Company, kind of like a rear element stationed away to be able to provide QRF. Tactically speaking, right, this makes sense because you want to run one element that's going to be like a little bit away from everything else so that should the outpost fall under heavy attack, all forces aren't pinned down or otherwise wiped out. You have a detachment that can come in and reinforce. These French Foreign Legion soldiers were not just sitting in and around the outpost all day. They were conducting day and night patrols continuously, searching for the enemy, idea being to find and close with the enemy so that they aren't able to set up ambushes and otherwise erode the French ability to transport on Road number 6. On top of this hill, the men were hunkered down in 4-man-sized bunkers, either dug into the earth or reinforced with sandbags and concrete blocks. But just to give you an idea, right, like a company is about 120 to 200 in the most maximum size company, and you got 4-man bunkers. So this is a big hill, and it's just filled with bunkers everywhere, facing every direction, and a bunch of trenches in between all the bunkers, and then a communication trench to the other strong point, which is a very similar situation. So a heavily entrenched fighting force, surrounded by minefields and concertina wire, reinforced with a couple companies outside the hill line. Also, they're always conducting patrols day in and day out. Not exactly what you would call a soft target. Anyway, since the French Foreign Legion occupied this area and, day and night patrolling was the norm, it's not much of a surprise that on the night of January 8th, a 2-patrol element came back to the wire. And as they were coming back into the wire, little did they know that a Viet Minh element that they had failed to come into contact with on their patrol watched closely as they meandered their way through the minefield and the concertina wire back into the outpost. This gave the Viet Minh a clear picture as to the safest way to get into the outpost without detonating themselves on the huge minefield surrounding the whole place. As soon as the second patrol and last patrol made its way back into the outpost at about 01:10 that night, just as the second element of the patrol had safely re-entered the outpost, to Corporal Felipez of 1st Platoon 5th Company's absolute horror, he sensed behind him a presence. Maybe he smelled something, maybe he heard something, maybe he just felt the hair on the back of his neck stick up. Doesn't really matter. He turned around and he saw black forms emerging from the shadows. Operating on pure good training and instinct, he flipped his safety selector to fire and unloaded his Tommy gun into the forms behind him. At that exact moment, all hell broke loose as the Viet Minh unloaded a salvo of enemy mortars onto the position. The Viet Minh, having followed carefully on the heels of the two patrols going back into the outpost, were close enough that by the time the enemy contact was realized, it was too late, and 1st and 2nd platoons were overrun almost immediately. Coordinated Viet Minh small arms and mortar fire suppressed the bunkers holding 1st and 2nd platoon, so that by the time they realized they were being attacked, they were already suppressed to the point where their attempt to engage the Viet Minh from the bunkers was very ineffective. At that same time, mortar fire was also raining down on 7th Company, which occupied the easternmost strong point of the hill. The platoons at this strong point likewise were suppressed and unable to effectively fight back against the Viet Minh, who were at this point swarming into the position through the concertina wire. Well-coordinated Viet Minh assault troops armed with TNT blocks and Bangalore torpedoes ran in and immediately started detonating the bunkers housing the 4-man teams of the French Foreign Legions. Within 30 minutes, 2 platoons had been overrun, and the survivors had collapsed down on 3rd Platoon's location, which was acting as a reserve position. 4th Platoon was still holding its own, but the Viet Minh, with recoilless rifles and mortars that they had dragged with them, now began to target 8th Company, which they knew stood in reserve across the road to the south. Around 0400 that morning, 5th Company, holding the easternmost strong point of the hill, badly wounded, with most of their officers and NCOs dead or severely wounded, decided that it was time to make a desperate attempt at a counterattack. They fixed bayonets, grabbed their grenades. Neither the remaining soldiers of 5th Company or the Viet Minh were willing to withdraw, and they fought in a desperate pitched battle where the Viet Minh were slowly getting hacked to pieces by the French Foreign Legion. One French Foreign Legionnaire recounts, quote, "Finally, one last surviving Viet Minh broke and ran. He jumped the barbed wire in one single leap, began to zigzag down the ravine. We literally cut him to shreds. It probably isn't a nice thing to say, but I think I must have emptied a whole clip into him. He had fallen down, but he was still rolling down the ravine. Then Sergeant Thomas, one of the few survivors of the 1st Platoon, touched my shoulder and, motioning me to cease firing, raised his carbine. A single shot rang out, and the body now remained motionless. It was 1st Platoon's revenge." End quote. When first light finally broke and the Viet Minh had receded back into the jungle, the French Foreign Legionnaires who had survived looked around and found hundreds of Viet Minh bodies strewn about. 5th Company counted more than 700 dead around the hill. The French Foreign Legion troops certainly weren't unscathed, with 2 platoons being almost completely annihilated in the combat. Despite the carnage inflicted by the French against the Viet Minh during this battle, it had little effect. The Viet Minh still maintained a domineering presence in the area, with their 304th Division commanding the heights overlooking much of the road, such to the point that they ended up on the very next day almost annihilating an entire French mobile battalion that had passed through the road unaware that the area surrounding the road was occupied by the 304th. To break through the blocking position held by the Viet Minh on Route Number 6, it required 3 French infantry battalions and 1 French artillery battalion to break this blockade. By the time that they did, they had lost nearly 100 vehicles along a 25-mile stretch of the road. Bernard B. Fall writes that, quote, "In spite of considerable reinforcements, the airborne task force under Colonel Giles made only painfully slow headway against ever-increasing enemy resistance along Route Number 6. In fact, the whole 25-mile stretch had now become one vast cavalry, finally absorbing 12 battalions of infantry and 3 artillery groups, not to speak of hundreds of fighter bombers and aerial supply missions, to resupply 5 infantry battalions locked up in a pocket without the slightest offensive value, end quote. The Viet Minh resistance on this road was so intense that it took Colonel Giles's task force 11 full days to move 25 miles. The Hoa Binh meat grinder battle required the French to commit nearly 1/3 of their entire mobile group force available for the entire Red River Delta theater of operation. This, unfortunately for the French, reduced their ability to fight the Viet Minh that were ever steadily increasing their number of troops who had infiltrated deep behind French lines into the Red River Delta itself. Now, one thing to note here is that while the French soldiers were dying on the battlefield during this Hoa Binh operation set in motion by Marshal Jean de la Trobe de Tassigny, the Marshal himself was in Paris dying of cancer. He passed away before the operation was concluded, and it became the responsibility of his successor, General Salon, to figure out how to extricate the troops now surrounded in the Hoa Binh salient. The evacuation of Hoa Binh began on February 22nd, 1952 at 1900 hours. The plan was to open up the Black River once more and initiate a 3-phased retreat under a constant barrage of artillery and fighter bomber support, which dropped more than 30,000 shells on the area between February 22nd and February 24th. The combat troops in the area began their phased retreat. It basically broke down into a continuous firefight the entire time as French units held each post to the last minute to allow the troops behind to funnel through to the next outpost. Fighting with the desperation of a trapped animal, the French forces finally managed to completely break out on February 24th. By the end of the meat grinder battle of Hoa Binh, the Viet Minh had taken on extraordinarily high casualties. The French had taken their share of casualties as well, of course, but in the grand scheme of things, the French go down in history as being the biggest loser from this battle because not only did they lose troops, they lost equipment, and they lost the political victory that they desperately needed to gain public support back home in France for increased military funding and troop allocation. All right, so on that note, I'm going to wrap it up for today's episode. Anybody who's keeping track in the timeline, that brings us to about spring 1952. In the following episodes, we'll pick up in the timeline and we'll continue to march. All of this is heading towards the decisive battle and victory for the Viet Minh called the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. You might have heard about it. That's a little bit of a ways off, but there's a lot of cool history in between the spring of 1952 and 1954 when that battle takes place. But I also want to touch upon the Korea War in broad strokes, and I want to talk about the Chosin Reservoir and some of the combat that America saw in Korea. It's contextually important in a broader geopolitical sense and Cold War sense, but also, I will admit, I'm pretty amped on Korea right now because I just read a book by a man known as Hampton Sides, and the book he wrote is called On Desperate Ground, and it's about the Marines at the Chosin Reservoir. And I got to tell you, this is one of the greatest books I've ever read. He wrote another book called Ghost Soldiers about Rangers conducting a POW rescue in the Philippines. He's a great military war historian, writer. Highly recommended, on desperate ground. But anyway, I'll save the talk about Korea for another episode. Highly recommend, if you're interested or don't know much about Korea, you look into it. All I can say is that it's insane, and it's America's experience with fighting hordes and hordes of enemies. In their case, it was the Chinese. But anyway, I want to give a shout out to all my listeners out there. I've been getting a lot of good feedback from people. I'm going to read a couple comments and give a shout out to Isaac on X. He says, "Hey, your podcast is great." Appreciate that, my brother. Appreciate that a lot. And I'm going to read a comment by a Spotify listener. His name is Paul John. He says, "More propaganda than real history. Shame." That was left on my History Refresher Part 1. Hey, John Paul. Listen, man. Oh, Paul John. Sorry. I don't mean to espouse propaganda. I'm curious to know what you consider to be the propaganda versus the real history in that episode. I'm always open to hearing new perspective on history. That's the beauty of history is, we get fragments. The victor often writes history, and the true picture is never going to be truly what it is in the history books. So if you have insights that you would like to share with me, I welcome them. Shoot me an email, shoot me a message, write back in a reply. But regardless, hey, all inputs welcome. Another Spotify listener, Chris Fox, writes, "We aren't the good guys, haven't been in a long time. No justification for this scale of murder in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map today, more or less then. I don't agree with the degrading of soldiers, but politicians are so off limits, never pay any consequences, that it's natural for people to want repercussions for actions. Generals are as vile as judges and cops, all the same side of the fascism coin. Look forward to hearing the rest of this story." Chris, I appreciate your comment. I appreciate your feedback. Thanks for the support. I say that I will agree with you on one point that you make, and that is that generals and politicians often don't face consequences for the decisions they make, but that's the thing that they do get is criticism in the history books, and how history portrays them in the long run, how their legacy reflects, is their reward or punishment for what they did while they were in charge. The tragedy is that often they don't live long enough to really see the ramifications of their decisions. That is kind of the tragic aspect of the way humanity has organized itself, not just in America, but all across the world. It does seem that the oldest people end up being in charge, and they don't really live long enough to see the long-term consequences of the policy and decisions that they make. All right, everybody. I appreciate the comments. I appreciate the love. I'm always happy to facilitate philosophical dialogue on what is the nature of reality versus propaganda, especially relevant in 2025, I'd say. So, much love to everybody out there. Godspeed. Be brave. Be bold. Stay friendly. Talk to everybody next time. Peace.